In the final desperate weeks before Corregidor's surrender in May of 1942, a group of American Army and Navy nurses continued working inside the reinforced Malinta Tunnel, treating a steady stream of wounded men under continuous Japanese bombardment, refusing evacuation offers that would have gotten them out before the island fell. When Corregidor finally surrendered, these women, roughly 90 nurses in total who had served throughout the Bataan and Corregidor campaign, became prisoners of war, beginning nearly 3 years of captivity, during which every single one of them, remarkably, would survive, even as they continued practicing medicine for their fellow prisoners throughout the entire ordeal. This is the story of what happened to the nurses captured on Corregidor, women who came to be known as the Angels of Bataan, and whose story remained largely overlooked in popular memory of the Pacific War for decades after their eventual liberation. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How did a group of women, thrust into one of the most brutal military campaigns of the entire Pacific War, and then held as prisoners for nearly 3 years, manage not only to survive almost entirely intact as a group, but to continue serving as medical professionals for the very prisoners they were held alongside? The specific composition of this nursing corps reflected the broader structure of American military medical staffing in the pre-war Philippines, drawing both Army Nurse Corps personnel assigned to garrison hospitals and a smaller contingent of Navy nurses attached to naval medical facilities in the islands. Women who, in most cases, had volunteered for military nursing service years before the war began, without any specific expectation that their overseas assignment would place them directly in the path of a major military campaign. It is worth noting that these American military nurses were not the only medical and civilian women caught up directly in the Philippines campaign, since Filipino civilian nurses and medical staff worked alongside their American counterparts throughout the Bataan and Corregidor campaign as well, often facing comparable dangers with considerably less subsequent historical documentation or recognition. A broader pattern of uneven attention to Filipino contributions and sacrifices during the Philippines campaign that this channel has touched upon in earlier episodes covering the Bataan Death March and the Great Raid at Cabanatuan. American Army and Navy nurses had been stationed in the Philippines for years before the war began, part of the standard peacetime medical staffing for American military installations across the islands. And when Japanese forces invaded in December of 1941, these women found themselves thrust immediately into the kind of sustained, brutal combat medical work that few of them could have anticipated when they had originally volunteered for what had, until that point, been a relatively routine overseas assignment. As American and Filipino forces withdrew onto the Bataan Peninsula in the war's opening weeks, military nurses were assigned to field hospitals established to treat the rapidly mounting casualties from the fighting. Hospitals that, despite bearing clear Red Cross markings, intended to identify them as protected medical facilities under international law, frequently came under Japanese bombardment regardless. Conditions inside these Bataan field hospitals deteriorated rapidly as the campaign wore on, with medical supplies running critically short, patient numbers far exceeding the facility's intended capacity, and the same severe food shortages afflicting the broader garrison also affecting the nurses and the patients they were caring for, a set of conditions that made the nurses' medical work increasingly difficult even as the volume and severity of casualties requiring treatment continued to grow throughout the Bataan campaign's final desperate weeks. Chief Army Nurse Maud Davison, who held overall responsibility for coordinating Army nursing personnel throughout the Bataan and Corregidor campaign, faced the considerable administrative and logistical challenge of maintaining organized medical care under conditions of chronic supply shortage and continuous enemy action, a leadership role that several nurses serving under her later credited with helping maintain the discipline and organizational structure that would prove essential not only during the active combat phase of the campaign, but throughout the extended captivity that followed. As Bataan's fall became increasingly inevitable in early April of 1942, most of the nurses stationed there were evacuated across to the fortress island of Corregidor, continuing their medical work inside the Malinta Tunnel, a reinforced underground facility that had been converted into a hospital and command center capable of withstanding the kind of sustained bombardment that conventional above-ground medical facilities simply could not survive. This evacuation spared the nurses from the catastrophic fate that awaited the male soldiers left behind on Bataan, who would shortly be forced into the Death March this channel has covered in detail in an earlier episode. Though the nurses who reached Corregidor traded one dangerous and difficult situation for another, continuing their medical work under siege conditions that, while different from Bataan's brutal march, carried their own serious and sustained dangers. The specific working conditions inside the Malinta Tunnel's hospital ward, carved directly into the island's volcanic rock and reinforced against the naval and aerial bombardment Corregidor endured almost continuously through the siege's final weeks, combined physical safety from direct blast effects with a genuinely difficult working environment, poor ventilation, artificial lighting, and the constant vibration and noise of nearby explosions transmitted through the surrounding rock, conditions that added their own distinct physical and psychological toll to the already demanding work of treating a continuous flow of combat casualties. Inside the Malinta Tunnel, nurses worked in cramped, poorly ventilated conditions, treating an unending stream of wounded from the continuing siege, working extended shifts under psychological pressure that several nurses later described, in post-war interviews, as unlike anything their pre-war training had prepared them for, a sustained, weeks-long ordeal of treating catastrophic wounds in an underground facility that itself remained under continuous Japanese bombardment from the surface above. Some nurses did accept evacuation when opportunities arose during Corregidor's final weeks, and a small number were successfully flown out or evacuated by submarine before the island's surrender. Decisions that reflected the same difficult individual calculations facing many personnel in the besieged garrison's final days, weighing personal survival against continued service to patients and colleagues, with no single uniform choice representing the correct or expected response, given the genuinely impossible circumstances every person on the island faced as surrender became increasingly inevitable. Stop and consider the specific decision several of these nurses actively made when evacuation opportunities did present themselves in Corregidor's final days, because a number of nurses reportedly declined offers to be evacuated by submarine or aircraft before the island's surrender, choosing instead to remain with their patients through to the very end of organized resistance. This was not a decision imposed upon them by military necessity alone, but, in a number of documented cases, a genuinely voluntary choice to continue their medical duties, rather than accept personal safety, while patients under their care remained in need of treatment, a decision that reflected the same professional and personal commitment that had defined their conduct throughout the entire campaign. The surrender itself brought an immediate and uncertain transition period for the nurses present, since neither they nor their Japanese captors had clear, established protocols for handling female military medical personnel taken prisoner in these specific circumstances. A genuinely novel situation for Japanese occupation authorities that resulted in an initial period of administrative uncertainty before the nurses were eventually processed and transferred toward what would become their longer-term internment arrangement at Santo Tomas. When Corregidor finally surrendered on May 6, 1942, the nurses present became prisoners of war alongside the male military personnel, though their subsequent captivity would follow a distinctly different path than the brutal Bataan Death March and the harsh military POW camps that awaited the captured soldiers. Most of the nurses were eventually transferred to Santo Tomas internment camp, a civilian internment facility established by Japanese occupation authorities inside a former university campus in Manila, where they would spend the majority of their remaining captivity housed alongside American and Allied civilian internees, rather than in the military POW camp system. Santo Tomas itself housed a broad cross-section of American and Allied civilians who had been living or working in the Philippines when the war began. Business people, missionaries, teachers, and their families, alongside the military nurses, creating a camp population considerably more diverse in background and prior life experience than the more purely military POW camps holding captured combat soldiers elsewhere in the Pacific. A demographic mix that shaped both the internal social dynamics of the camp and the specific medical needs the nurses found themselves responsible for addressing, since the camp population included elderly internees, young children, and others with medical vulnerabilities not typically present in a strictly military prison population. Conditions inside Santo Tomas, while generally less immediately brutal than the military POW camps and the Death March that had claimed so many lives among the captured soldiers, still involved serious and sustained hardship over the internment's nearly 3-year duration, including chronic and worsening malnutrition, as Japanese occupation authorities' willingness and ability to adequately provision the camp's population deteriorated steadily as the war continued, and Japan's own logistics situation grew increasingly strained. Medical supplies inside the camp remained a persistent and worsening challenge throughout the internment, with the nurses forced to work with whatever limited medications and equipment Japanese camp administration provided, supplemented in various periods by supplies smuggled in through Filipino resistance networks and, at certain points during the war, limited Red Cross parcels that reached the camp. Resources the nurses had to allocate carefully across a growing range of medical needs, as malnutrition-related illness became increasingly prevalent throughout the camp population as the occupation continued. The nurses, despite their own status as prisoners suffering the same deprivation as every other internee, continued practicing medicine throughout their captivity, establishing and running medical facilities within the camp to treat fellow internees suffering from malnutrition, tropical disease, and the ordinary range of medical needs that a confined population of several thousand people would generate over nearly 3 years. Captain Josephine Nesbitt, among the senior nursing officers whose leadership within the camp's internal medical organization proved particularly significant during this period, worked alongside Davison and other senior nurses to establish the kind of consistent, disciplined medical protocols that allowed the small nursing staff to manage the needs of a camp population numbering in the thousands, an organizational achievement that several post-war accounts have specifically credited with preventing what could otherwise have been a far more severe public health crisis within the camp, given the limited resources actually available. This continued medical service, provided by women who were themselves prisoners, enduring the same hardships as their patients, represented a remarkable and sustained act of professional commitment that camp administrators and fellow internees alike came to depend upon heavily as the internment continued, with the nurses organizing themselves under military-style command structure even within the internment camp environment, maintaining discipline and medical standards that several post-war accounts credit directly with saving lives among the broader internee population that might otherwise have been lost to the camp's deteriorating conditions in the absence of organized professional medical care. Some nurses, along with a small number of other Santo Tomas internees, were transferred at various points during the internment to a separate camp at Los Baños, a related internment facility south of Manila that housed additional American and Allied civilian prisoners under broadly similar conditions, meaning the specific experience of captivity varied somewhat depending on which particular camp and time period an individual nurse's captivity spanned. though the overall pattern of chronic hardship and sustained medical service remained broadly consistent across both locations. The nurses' physical condition, like that of every internee at Santo Tomas, deteriorated significantly through the camp's final year, as Japanese supply difficulties worsened, and food rations shrank to levels that left the entire internee population suffering from severe malnutrition by early 1945. A crisis that reached its most dangerous point in the weeks immediately preceding the camp's eventual liberation, when starvation-level conditions genuinely threatened the survival of internees across the camp, regardless of their prior physical condition or the medical care the nurses continued providing under increasingly desperate circumstances. The liberation of Santo Tomas itself unfolded as a dramatic and, for the exhausted internees, almost disorienting rapid transition from years of captivity to sudden freedom, with American armored cavalry units conducting a fast, aggressive advance specifically intended to reach and secure the camp before retreating Japanese forces could harm the internees. An operation that succeeded in liberating the vast majority of the camp's population intact, though the fighting to secure the camp fully and clear remaining Japanese resistance in the immediate area continued for some additional time, even after the initial liberating force arrived. Liberation finally came in early February of 1945, when American forces, advancing rapidly toward Manila as part of the broader liberation of the Philippines, reached Santo Tomas and freed the camp's internees, including every one of the American military nurses who had been held captive since Corregidor's surrender nearly 3 years earlier. The nurses' physical condition upon liberation, while significantly deteriorated from the effects of chronic malnutrition experienced throughout the camp's final year, allowed for a recovery that, unlike the far more severe and sometimes fatal health complications documented among survivors of the Bataan Death March and the harsher military POW camps, generally proceeded without the same catastrophic long-term medical consequences, a difference in post-war physical recovery that reflected both the somewhat less extreme severity of conditions at Santo Tomas relative to the military camp system and the direct benefit of having trained medical professionals among the internee population working continuously to manage and mitigate the health effects of the camp's deprivation for as long as their own limited resources allowed. The fact that all of these nurses survived their captivity intact, a remarkable outcome given the severity of conditions in the camp's final months and the catastrophically high mortality rates that had characterized other Pacific War POW experiences, this channel has documented in earlier episodes, reflected both fortunate timing in the liberation's arrival and the nurses' own sustained, disciplined efforts to care for one another and maintain group cohesion throughout the entire ordeal. Upon their return to the United States, the nurses received a public reception considerably more modest than the sustained national attention given to some other Pacific War homecoming stories. A relatively muted public response that several of the nurses themselves later reflected on with some ambivalence in post-war interviews. Noting both genuine appreciation for whatever recognition they did receive and an awareness that their specific story had not captured the same sustained public attention as certain other Pacific War narratives being told and retold in American popular culture during the same immediate post-war period. For decades following the war, the story of these nurses, who came to be known collectively as the Angels of Bataan, received considerably less public attention and historical documentation than many other dimensions of the Pacific War, a relative obscurity that several historians studying the gender dynamics of wartime historical memory have attributed to a broader post-war pattern in which women's military service, however genuinely dangerous and consequential, received less sustained public and institutional recognition than comparable service by male combat personnel. This relative muted recognition stood in a notable and, to many later historians, and to some of the nurses themselves, uncomfortable contrast to the specific danger and sustained professional demands their service had actually involved. Women who had worked through direct combat conditions, endured a hostile siege, and then continued practicing medicine under nearly 3 years of captivity. A record of service and endurance that, judged purely on its own merits, compared favorably to many more publicly celebrated wartime narratives from the same theater and period. Several of the nurses did receive Bronze Stars and other military decorations recognizing their service, but the broader public memory of their specific story remained considerably less developed than the more extensively documented experiences of male Bataan and Corregidor veterans for many years following the war's end. Elizabeth Norman's widely read History of the Nurses, published decades after the war and drawing extensively on surviving nurses' own testimony and personal records, played a particularly significant role in bringing this story to broader public attention, presenting a detailed and carefully researched account that helped establish the Angels of Bataan as a subject worthy of the same sustained historical attention given to other major Pacific War narratives. A corrective effort that arrived, for many of the surviving nurses themselves, only very late in their own lives, decades after the wartime service and captivity that the book finally documented in full. In the decades since, historians, journalists, and the nurses' own surviving accounts and interviews have worked to bring fuller public attention to this specific chapter of the Pacific War, documenting in detail both the harrowing medical work performed under siege conditions on Bataan and Corregidor, and the sustained, disciplined medical service the nurses continued providing throughout their subsequent internment, a body of historical work that has gradually restored the Angels of Bataan to a more prominent place in the broader public understanding of the Pacific War's Philippines campaign, recognizing both the specific danger these women faced and the specific, professional commitment they maintained toward the patients and fellow internees under their care throughout nearly 3 years of captivity that few of them could have anticipated when they first volunteered for what had originally seemed like a routine peacetime overseas nursing assignment. Remember the question this story opened with: how did these women manage not only to survive almost entirely intact as a group, but to continue functioning as medical professionals throughout their entire captivity? The honest answer, established through decades of subsequent historical documentation and the nurses' own first-hand accounts, is that it came down to exactly the combination this story has traced: disciplined leadership under Davison and Nesbitt that maintained military-style organization even inside a civilian internment camp, a professional commitment to their patients that several of them had already demonstrated by declining evacuation before Corregidor's surrender, and a collective determination to care for one another that persisted through nearly 3 years of chronic hardship, a record of endurance and service that took decades longer than it should have to receive the historical recognition it had earned from the very beginning. If you want to understand how a group of American military nurses endured combat conditions, a brutal siege, and nearly 3 years of captivity, while continuing to practice medicine for the patients and fellow prisoners who depended on them, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.